So Patti, our interview today with Kristin was just incredible. I don't really know any other word to say for it. If you're in our industry, you need to listen to this one. If you're thinking about getting into our industry, if you're thinking about monetizing payments, if you're thinking about growing your ISO, this is kind of your guide to how the industry really works.
And it really is a how-to. And I think we should explain to people, which this episode's a little bit longer than some of our episodes.
Yes.
But really be patient and stick with it, because Kristin has some incredible insights on the industry. James and I combined, what do we have, about 60 or 70 years in the industry, right? And she blew us both out. I mean, we both came away going, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she was so good at explaining it. So if you want to know what a Payfac is, if you want to know what's the difference between a wholesale ISO and a retail ISO, if you want to know what a full service provider is, if you want to know what a sponsor bank and an acquiring bank, if you want to know what it means to clear transactions,
if you want to know whether or not you should set up a Payfac, become a Payfac.
Should you become a Payfac? Right, exactly. So all these questions and many more we answer today. And then I really switched gears hard going into the questions from the field, because I wanted to have something in our episode for the salesperson who maybe isn't as interested in the details of the inner workings of the industry, although they probably should be. But we talk about becoming an expert in sales. And we talk about kind of how to focus and the keys to really being successful as a sales agent today and growing towards the future. And then I was actually really blown away by your insider's report today as well, Patti. Very surprised by that. So tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's about fraud on P2P networks. And in particular, the Zelle network, which is owned by the largest banks in the country. It was, when I saw it, I was pretty stunned. And I think you'll find this quite interesting. So our episode today is brought to you by NMI.com, NMI. And I'm ready to get going if you are, James.
All right, let's start our interview with Kristin.
Welcome to the Merchant Sales Podcast.
Hey everybody, Patti and I are here today with Kristin McWilliams. She is a full board member at the Midwestern Acquirers Association, among doing many, many other things. How are you doing today, Kristin?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Great to have you. So today, I think is going to be one of our most interesting conversations we've had on the podcast, because poor Kristin here, I've literally sent her every complicated question in the industry, basically, and asked her to answer them. So we're going to really dive in. I get so many questions from consulting clients, ISOs, agents even, of what does it look like to grow an organization in this business? What is a Payfac? What is a wholesale ISO? What's an FSP? All these kind of what are these things type of questions. And today, we're not going to be able to answer all of those, but we're going to dive into the big ones and try to answer a lot of those questions. But before we do that, Kristin, your first time interview on this podcast, give us your story. How did you get into the payments industry, and talk a little bit about what you do today?
So I started back in 98 with First Data, and I was there about 16 years. So when I started, our only clients were FSPs. They were banks, credit union associations, things of that nature. There were no ISO programs. There was an agent program, but and I think I was the fourth person to get tapped to work on a brand new turnkey acquiring solution that one of our VPs thought of that turned into our ISO program.
Wow.
So amazing. We really built that. I mean, we didn't have a way to board merchants. We had to convince risk and underwriting that we weren't out to take over the world in a nefarious way.
Right.
It was really interesting trying to get resources. So we did that. And after that, I dabbled briefly in high risk, because that was an area I had no knowledge in. Went to work for a wholesale ISO that was a former client. Worked for Payfac, where we ended up doing a processor change in the middle of that. So that was good to see that whole process from start to finish. And most recently was in kind of alternative payment methods and digital wallets, which was also a new area for me. So that was really interesting to learn.
So you've been all around the industry. I mean, pretty much. Yeah.
Yep. And from merchant facing to having banks as clients. So it's been a unique perspective for me.
Very unique perspective. I think that makes you really well suited to these questions that James and I have put together.
Yeah, it's like I feel like this list. I've had this list of questions for a long time. I just haven't found the right guest to answer them all. So we'll see how you do today, Kristin. So I'm just gonna fire them at you here. All right. So here we go. First question, I think probably the easiest one, but the one I get asked a lot, especially by the agent in the small ISO. What is, people say, I want to become an ISO. And it's like, well, that's actually not enough information. So tell us, what is the difference between you have the registered concept of the registered ISO, you have the retail concept, the retail ISO, you have the wholesale ISO. Give us a breakdown of like what these things actually are, what it means to kind of be an ISO in these different levels.
So, there was really kind of you consider a hierarchy in my mind where you start out, there's an agent level, there's a retail ISO level, there's a wholesale ISO level, and then an FSP level. And then the Payfac is not really part of that hierarchy. Right. It's kind of over here by itself. It's a whole different kind of beast. So the main difference between what I would say a retail and a wholesale ISO is who's doing the underwriting, who's managing the risk, who has the financial liability. And then there is a perception most of the time on who owns the paper. So who owns that merchant account? I think a lot of people, so in a retail environment, none of those things apply to a retail ISO. It's generally a liability-free deal. They're just out. It's a true sales organization. They're out signing up merchants. Right. They're out gathering paper for underwriting. They submit it. It gets decisioned. It's kind of out of their hands. The wholesale, they have to work within the same credit policy as a retail, even though there's a perception that they may have a different credit policy. It's the same. It's a bank policy. But they do get to do the underwriting, the risk monitoring. They also hold all the liability on their portfolio. And depending on how the contract is written, right, everything's negotiable. Right. They may or may not own that merchant account at the end of the day. And what that means is if they leave that processor or terminate or something, that they can take their merchants with them without penalty.
Right. So I think portability has actually become like really, really, really rare. I actually have hardly, you have to be a pretty big shop to negotiate portability, even as a wholesale ISO, at least in my experience. I don't know what you've seen, Kristin.
I've seen it literally in 2 contracts.
Yeah, that's what
in 20 some odd years.
Yeah.
So yeah. I think it was for a long time, it was just a perception. People thought that because they were a wholesale that they had portability, even though that's not
really what don't. So, Kristin, talk a little bit about registration of the ISO as well. Is that part of what you would consider being a retail ISO? Is that you're registered with the card brands as well? I would assume. Like, what are your thoughts on the registration? That's gotten a little bit murky because some of the large processors or super ISOs are saying, well, you can do a DBA registration through us. Right. And so talk about registration a little bit as well, if you would.
So the main advantage of registration is to be able to market under your own name. Right. And grow your brand. And honestly, the registration costs for wholesale, retail, and even Payfac, it's the same nowadays. It used to be, there was some variance. It's really the same now. So the registration of the DBA is a little murky. I personally, because that, like, let's say NAB, I think NAB does it, right?
They have white label, yeah.
And so they register that DBA under them,
right?
So that you can market under your name and all that. I'm not an attorney. I don't really know what kind of rights that gives them to your name. Let's say the relationship goes south.
Right.
So yes, you can market under your name, but you've kind of lost control of your brand at the same time.
Right. You basically, you better make sure that you are very much long-term committed to the company that you register your DBA under, because you just registered your DBA under theirs. Like your company is now a DBA of their company. And so like you said, everything is negotiable, but like that's a pretty big decision.
Yeah. And it is at DBA registrations at a state level. So, that I would definitely.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I see what you're saying, because it could. Yeah.
Yeah. Where I see it working pretty well, I see, and there's like 3 companies that are pretty big that do it now. And where I see it being successful is like the individual agent who is going to hire a staff. They're going to have an assistant and somebody's calling to do lead generation. And that's about as much as they're trying to grow. They're really comfortable with this big company they're with, but they really do want to build a local brand. So the brand itself isn't going to be like massively valuable. It's almost more of an extension of their personal brand. So, but they don't want to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on attorney fees and registration costs and all that. So then they'll register DBA. But yeah, I think if you're really serious about your brand, you probably want to keep it. It would be an idea,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely would, but unless I mean, things happen, right? Relationships change. So
Right. Okay, so let's get back on track again, because we need to now maybe make the distinction between a wholesale ISO and a Payfac. You mentioned how the Payfac's kind of over here while the ISOs are over here. Can you explain what's in that chasm? What makes them so different?
Yeah. So, a wholesale ISOs is like a grown-up retail, right? That's taken all of that in-house, right? The risk and all that. So the main difference between a wholesale ISO and a Payfac is obviously speed to boarding, technology, funding and reconciliation, statementing, and a lot of other things. So what people probably don't know is that the Payfac model is issued a master mid, right? So they have this one mid. Okay. And then all the merchants that are underneath that are submids. Okay. So at the end of the day, at the end of every day, the processor will settle a lump sum to that master mid, net out processor fees, interchange, dues and assessments, kilowatt, whatever fees the card brands have going on that day. So they get this lump sum settlement. Now the Payfac has to reconcile all that and fund the merchants.
Okay. Yeah. Big difference.
And the processors don't really give the Payfacs tools to do that, right? That's the Payfac as a service, and that's why they exist. But a true Payfac has to build all of this out. So they need a internal tool dashboard. They need a client-facing tool so the merchants can reconcile. They need, they have to build all that out. All those things that, as an ISO, you would take it for granted that your processor is going to provide. A Payfac has to build all of that.
Yeah.
Do you think
that's the tech stack that they always refer to, right? That's their big tech stack.
Right. Sure.
And they generally will also have a gateway where they're directing all of that traffic as well, so that they can help to manage that.
Do you think that's going to change significantly over the next 24 months, 36 months, Kristin? As in other words, do you see companies already? There's some companies that are providing the infrastructure to say, like, we'll help you become a Payfac and give you the tech. And so I guess my question is, when we look at the difference between a wholesale ISO and a Payfac, 36 months from now, if I'm a retail ISO and I'm like, I want to go to the next step. I guess my big question is, in 36 months, why would someone choose to become a wholesale ISO versus choosing to become a Payfac, assuming that becoming a Payfac means you have to pay for tech? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, is the difference going to get narrow enough to where it's like there's less of a barrier there, where it's like, why would I become a wholesale ISO and still have the friction of this like legacy system versus becoming a Payfac and doing whatever I want? I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on how this is going to like evolve in that way.
Well, Payfac doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Right. So I think there was a perception for a long time that Payfacs could do high risk and they could do this and they could do that. Nope. They're still bound by the same credit policy as any retailer wholesale ISO. It's determined by the bank. And those days, the wild west of the Payfacs are over. and all those guys got shut down a couple of years ago, really. The Payfac as a service, and there are companies that will partner, basically say, okay, you can use this as Payfac as a service, and we've already built all this other stuff out. And then there's others that are like, we'll partner with you as far as being a technology partner and help, build you up to speed. My question is always to anybody thinking about becoming a Payfac is, what are they trying to solve for? Right.
And usually it's instant or nearly instant onboarding or some version of friction in the onboarding process.
You can do that with a wholesale ISO. You know, there's and especially with certain processors, you can go real time live. There's no reason you can't. You might delay funding for a day or two, and you'd want to do that anyway while you complete your underwriting.
Right.
But what a Payfac does, like what the best example I can always find of where a Payfac makes perfect sense is Intuit, right? Like QuickBooks, right? Everybody knows QuickBooks.
Yep.
So you get this. I'm a small merchant. I'm just a business. I get QuickBooks in to do my accounting. I'll flash, like a hosted page will pop up and say, hey, do you want to accept credit cards? And I say, yeah, let's do that. I enter like 12 pieces of information. Boom, I'm live. It makes perfect sense for them. You have to have a reason to be a Payfac. You either have a piece of software, or you have a POS system, or you have a plug for your gateway. You have to be solving for something, right? Like just randomly becoming a Payfac, like to integrate a bunch of terminals would be insanity.
Oh, right. Because now you're going to you have to get certified for each of these terminals that you want to offer.
Exactly.
That's a really
because you're going to get an API, right? This is all API driven. Right. And unless it makes sense if you have your own gateway, then it makes sense again, because then you can integrate things into your gateway. Your gateway certified with, and the certification for a Payfac versus other channels is different, with the processors as well. Not all products are available through their Payfac certification channels. They're all kind of catching up. I mean, in reality, 5 years ago, there was literally one processor that had a decent Payfac channel.
Right.
And now everybody's kind of piecing theirs together. Yeah. And it's a bit of a it's super clunky.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So, unless you're trying to solve for something like that, I don't know that it makes sense to pony up, $500,000 in 2 years of your time to build out your tech stack.
Okay. So let's get one more set of definitions. I wanted to make sure we get everybody clear on is the role of the acquiring bank, the sponsor bank. What role do these play in the Payfac model?
Same role they always pay, right? Like at the end of the day, you've got to have a member to clear your transactions.
Right.
Same.
So that's all it is. It's just basically a name that they get to put at the bottom of the website.
It's that, but the bank is taking, ultimately the bank takes the liability, right? But then it all flows downhill.
But exactly. It all trickles down. So
give us a little more context there, Kristin, for those that are, again, maybe somebody's got a retail ISO, they've got 30 salespeople, they've never done anything, they don't know how any of this works. Like they just they got registered because they wanted to promote their brand and all they know is sales, but they're thinking, I want to become either a wholesale ISO or maybe I've got some software and I want to do a Payfac. For that person, when you talk about, the sponsor bank, the acquiring bank, like talk to us about a transaction. Like, how does that work? You say clearing the transaction. What does that mean? Like, give us a little more context, if you would, on that. Like, how does that work? Why do you need the bank? I guess is the question I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, for Visa, they have to be a member of Visa, MasterCard, right? They can't just be any bank. They have to be a member. And that's how, they have to, that's how a MID is generated, basically. I mean, that's the very lowest level there. You can't get a MID
without a bank.
Period.
Right.
So at the end of the day, you're issued a MID, you get MID, the merchant takes the transaction, it goes to your processor, it gets routed out through Visa and MasterCard, for settlement. That's all done at the bank level or the BIN and ICA level, or, however you want to think about that. Many, banks have many BINs and many ICAs, and they can either do it directly or they can, go through the Fed. This is however their settlement is routed, but that the bank or the member is the only one that can hold merchant money.
Right. Right. Is there any
No one
difference?
else.
Because, I've heard these terms used somewhat interchangeably over the years. Is there a difference between a sponsor bank and an acquiring bank? I mean, that's the same bank, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I've always thought, but I wanted to make sure that that was correct. Like, so when I
Yeah,
say, so notice I need a bank to clear the transactions and move the money. And that's going to be, I can call it the sponsor bank. I can call it the acquiring bank. It's the bank that's going to move the money for the merchant account.
Right.
Yeah. The only one that's allowed to.
Right. Okay. Got it. Really good. Okay. So now let's unpack one other term that gets, I think, overused a bit. And that is and it sounds like such a big word. It's the full service provider, FSP. It's like, oh, wow, we're the full service provider. What does that mean? Give us a little context of that one.
So that means they either are or have their own acquiring bank. They go to FIS, Fiserv, whoever, Global, and just buy processing services. That's it. That's all they're buying. They don't need their back office. They don't need under it. That's it. They're buying services. So they could be a bank, an association of banks, credit unions, or they could be like a super ISO, right? That has their own relationship with a bank, and they both come to the party, right? Like, so it could be, I don't know, Wells Fargo. And
Right.
I'm a super ISO and I have a relationship with Wells Fargo, but I'm going to leave this processor because of price, whatever concerns I have. And I'm going to move to this other processor. I'm going to bring my bank with me. And all three of us are going to sign an agreement, basically like a really complex, horrible tri-party agreement. But it's great for the FSP because they're just literally buying services.
Right.
They have a relationship with their bank, and that's their business. And the processor wants no piece of that. Right. They're not on the paper anywhere. They're not dictating any kind of guidelines or practices or anything else. They are just there to provide services.
Okay. Yep. Good. Very good. Okay. So we have these core definitions down. So now I want to talk about something that's a really hot topic. And I want to give a little context for this one because this is a very frustrating problem actually to me in my consulting practices. I talk to a lot of people that are, they're like the retail ISO, even some that are the wholesale ISO. And what they see when they kind of look at the world of processing today is they see these two realities. They see their current reality, which is they're with, not to, give a bad reputation to anybody, but I mean, this is everybody. This is FIS, this is Fiserv, this is TSYS, this is like Global, this is everybody that, the ISOs I work with, they don't have instant onboarding. They don't have anything close to that. Their online application is like a DocuSign agreement. Maybe they have an online agreement that maps to a DocuSign, right? But like I'm talking about, this is like 85% of the agents out there that are selling. This is their experience. Same thing with the ISO. So then they look and they see Square, they see Stripe, they see Toast. And they go, oh, okay. So the solution is Payfac. I need to become a Payfac in order to be able to do what the Payfacs are doing. Then they start diving into that. And it's like, oh, wow, that's actually really, really complex. Maybe I need to do Payfac as a service. Well, wait a minute. Payfac as a service really was kind of designed more for the ISV, really, than it was the ISO. I mean, they don't really, generally the Payfac as a service doesn't have a lot of like residual reporting and that sort of thing. So I think these ISOs are all confused. Frankly, sometimes I'm confused as to what to even advise because it's like, I totally agree that this is an unacceptable reality. We can't continue to compete with Toast and Square by providing a 17-page DocuSign agreement and waiting 3 days for underwriting. Like, that's stupid. So my question is, what do they do now? And how does this play out? Like, should they be looking at becoming a Payfac? We touched on it a little bit, the complexities of it. Or is it like, hey, these legacy companies are finally going to come. You mentioned earlier, well, you can do that with the wholesale ISO. How? What are we missing? Why are we not doing that now? So just talk to us about this kind of issue and kind of how the Payfac model should or should not play into the solution to this.
Yeah, I mean, that is probably the best part of the Payfac model is you can just shoot somebody over a URL and they'll fill out like I said, somewhere between 15 and 22 points of information, check a box saying that they agree to the terms and conditions, which is, the 47-page document that no one will print out.
Right.
Right. And then they're approved. And you mentioned Square and Stripe, and they are the granddaddies of the Payfac world, right? They're really the ones that started it. So, okay, they've got a 10-year, whatever, head start on everybody. So people need to remember that too. They've had a long time to get this down. Again, they need to be solving for something other than inconvenience. It's generally a vertical, or there's some kind of software, or there's something like that. Now, if some of these Payfacs as a services have APIs that support every kind of terminal known demand, terrific. Then maybe that's an option. But I'd say for ISOs that are servicing more of a niche market, they could probably work out where that makes sense at that point, right?
It makes sense to become a Payfac, you mean?
Yeah, like
Okay.
if they can figure it, I had a guy that sold almost exclusively to car washes,
Yes.
and
Okay.
petroleum stations, right? So that's a specific software, and if you can get that integrated, and they did it through like the POS, and it was unattended car wash piece of it, where you could
Right.
pay at the pump and do
Yep.
all that. So that made sense for them,
Sure.
because that is specifically what they're doing. They don't have a guy that's going to go out and try to replace a terminal.
Right. Right.
That's where it starts to really not make sense at all.
So let me see if I can
be technology driven.
Yeah, so let me see if I can restate this, and then feel free to tell me that I'm totally wrong in what I'm about to say. But let me see if I can restate this and tell me if I'm on the right track. So I think what I hear you saying is becoming a Payfac, which basically means you're becoming this kind of master mid, and then all the merchants you bring on are like a sub mid underneath of you. Where we have potentially concerns, or would be, if I'm an ISO and I have a bunch of 1099 reps running around just selling every type of merchant imaginable, then I'm still going to run into some pretty significant credit underwriting issues with the bank here, because they're going to say, well, what is this Payfac? Who do you sell? Like, I don't know. Is that part of it or no?
Well, when you register as a Payfac, it's a pretty thorough vetting that you go through with, and it's really with the processor that they're doing on behalf of the bank. But at the end of the day, the processor gathers up all this information and submits it to the bank.
Right.
I mean, you have to prove, they're going to ask, what kind of merchants are you going after? What are your MCC codes that you have today? What are you going to convert over? How are you boarding them? What does your staff look like? Who's doing your underwriting? They want to see resumes. They want to see this. They want to, it's a big deal.
Is all of that easier when you have a targeted, we're going after car washes versus saying, we have agents and we sell everybody? Like, is there?
It is. Yeah, I would say it is. They probably feel a little more secure and a little more like what you're doing. Right. And I mean, at the very least, if somebody looking to become a Payfac should have their own gateway. But that's not very focused, right? So a lot of them, maybe if you have some plugs that you've developed for either ERP systems or shopping carts or things of that nature, you've got to have a game plan to go to these, to go and get registered and sign these deals. You're signing deals that have minimum commitments. I mean, these are big deals. There's a lot of money, and you're going to get a certain ramp up period, a few months, but it could take a couple of years to build out that tech stack. So, you need to have a really solid plan a year in advance of going to them,
it's not something, what you're saying is it's not something you can take lightly.
No. And I mean,
can't wake up and say, I'm going to be a Payfac.
I mean, you literally have to figure out how to reconcile and fund everybody. You're going to have to create a merchant facing tool. You're going to need an internal dashboard. You're going to have to figure out how to route all these transactions so that you can keep track of them, because you're just going to get a bunch of raw data files at the end of the day from your processor, and you've got to parse that out and make sense of it.
Right.
And then even something as simple as statementing. Processors don't provide merchant statements for Payfacs.
Right.
You get to create that as a
Right.
Payfac.
Yeah, so it's kind of like
so inclined.
you have all this flexibility of like, oh, guess what? The statement can look however you want, but you have to create it. So,
And a lot of Payfacs do not do monthly statements.
Yeah. Right. Because if it's a point of sale system, they have their reporting dashboard that you can go to and look at, and that's all you get. Right. So, this is just so interesting to me. So I actually want to change this question a little bit, because here's what I hear you saying is definitely that for the kind of, again, the retail ISO, they're doing 50 to 200 deals a month. They want to get to the next level. It definitely sounds like what you're saying is your advice generally is become a wholesale ISO, not become a Payfac. Am I accurate there?
Yeah, unless they have a crack staff of developers, then
and deep pockets.
Right. So if they don't have a lot of capital, and they're not a technology company, and they don't have deep, pockets or a lot of capital, Payfac is maybe something that, would not be as good of an option. So my next question to you actually is, what is your advice to that company that is trying to solve, like you mentioned the word convenience, but I mean, really a lot of the ISOs I talk to, I mean, it's not just convenience, it's literally closing percentage, right? It's like, my agents aren't able to get deals done because the friction is so bad that they're not able to sign people up. I want them to have an iPad. I want them to fill out 3 screens, and I want them to get a deal done and have it up and running within a reasonable amount of time. Do you have any advice on how do they negotiate that? Or maybe it's not even available yet and the industry is moving that direction, or like, what's your advice to them to say, okay, Payfac maybe isn't a great solution for you, but you still have this unnecessary friction that exists. What should they do about that?
Well, I think really the key to those guys, like the traditional ISO model, it's always going to be necessary. But unless they somehow differentiate themselves, they're going to be competing with the same pool of people and drilling down to selling on price and the fact that they need to close the deal in 37 seconds. Right. And how to get around that. I mean, I would negotiate that, right, as part of your deal with, when you're negotiating with your processor. I think processors are figuring out that they have to be quicker and more nimble, especially in the wholesale game. But a lot of them wanted to get out of the wholesale market completely for a while, but now they're kind of edging back in.
Right.
But really, my best advice to, especially, a smaller to mid-sized retail ISO, is find your niche, right? And just go to town on that. It's amazing that there are so many opportunities out there. There's plenty of business for everybody. I mean, I don't mean to sound complacent or anything like that but there really is. And if you can find a niche and do it well, that's really kind of the key. And then you can build around that. You could even develop your own software around that.
Yeah. Right.
And then once you do that, wow, all of a sudden I can be an ISV as well. Right. And then you get all kinds of flexibility. And then, then maybe it makes sense. To become a Payfac, right?
It's so interesting to me, Kristin. I feel like I spent half my day talking ISOs into becoming ISVs, and the other half of my day convincing ISVs to become ISOs. And it's so interesting because I think that what you're saying plays perfectly into what Patti and I have really been talking about for 2 years, which is the future of the industry is that are there still going to be those ISOs out there that just go out and they sell everybody? Of course. And they're probably for a long time still going to be constrained to these friction points that exist because there's so much variation. I wrote about it in a recent Merchant Sales Insight. It's like, we want to speed up the underwriting process, but we want to be able to sell any merchant, any solution at any time. Well, the underwriting department's going to have a problem with that. How do you streamline that? There's an unlimited amount of variation and you want to streamline it. You can't do that. So it's like what you're saying is the key to kind of streamlining that is you got to streamline it. So you find a niche, you find a particular, maybe it's a processor agnostic software that you partner with and help them to monetize payments, or you buy it and bring it in house, or you hire your own developers and build something simple. But whatever it is, it's like you go after a particular niche, find the software angle. Then at that point, I think what you're saying is now maybe this Payfac looks good. I mean, do you see, I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but I would think 3 years from now, the concept of I want to become a Payfac, you're still going to have a lot to consider, but I would certainly hope that most of the processors at this point, or maybe even outside technology providers, this is maybe not a solved problem, but a much easier problem to say, we have the infrastructure. Like, you want to become a Payfac, we help you design your statement and everything else. Like, we have all the pieces in place that you can customize. What are your thoughts on them? Is it going to develop to a point where most of the processors have more of a streamlined approach to this, right?
Oh, absolutely, because it's going to afford the software or the processor more control,
Right.
which is always what they want with a Payfac, because it's less risk for them at that point, right?
Yep.
And if they provide a lot of these tools, then they can charge more money.
Yep.
Sure.
Yep.
So it makes sense for a processor to build all this out. But the issue is with one particular processor that we were working with, they did not have a very mature Payfac program, even though it had technically been around for a long time, but it was just kind of there, not being developed, right? It was really for those true Payfacs that would come in and that had their own tech stack and weren't afraid to do the heavy lift.
Yep.
Right. That's what that was for. And that's why they weren't horribly successful, because there just aren't that many companies that have the kind of experience that is required to do that. Right.
Yeah.
Not just the money and the time, but you need a lot of good people to do that as well.
Yes.
I think they've obviously, and now that since Payfac's such a buzzword, it's a money-making opportunity for them. So, right, they can charge more money, they can exercise more control, but then the downside for the person wanting to become a Payfac is they're going to lose some of the reasons why they wanted to become a Payfac in the first place, right?
Exactly.
It's going to look maybe a little bit more like an ISO, but then it's not going to be a true Payfac. It's going to be more the Payfac as a service.
Yeah. It's funny. Like, I ran into this problem with a really large company. Everybody would know that I was working with and doing some consulting, and, they became a Payfac, but they didn't want to do very much. So they leaned really heavily on the processor, and we got all done. They finished the project, and it was like, okay, cool. Let's talk about how to leverage this. And it was like, underwriting was having about the same turnaround time, and they were requesting all this additional information. And I'm like, what happened? And it's like, well, it turns out they negotiated they had the processor do so much that the processor was like, okay, fine. We're glad to have our underwriting handle all of these issues that come up, but then you're under our underwriting guidelines. Then it's like, well, wait a minute. Why did you become a Payfac? Like, right. And so I think that's a really good point, that you certainly don't want to, go down that path if you don't really want to go down that path and actually take on everything,
Well, and again, it all goes to my very first question I ask everybody that comes to me about Payfac is, what are you solving for?
Right. Why do you want to become a Payfac?
Don't lose sight of that, right?
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah.
Just in order to get to this end.
Yep.
Why did you want to get there so badly in the first place? And then you've like, oh, okay, well, that's not that much of a priority, blah, blah, blah. Oh yeah, it was. It was absolutely the priority.
Right. And this is one of these things where, whether you're partnering with somebody that's providing a lot of the tech stack or you're building it yourself, I mean, these are decisions that are extremely expensive to change.
Right.
Right. Like, you built it out and you're like, oh, wait a minute, we actually wanted to do it this way. Well, that was, a good example of this, Kristin, my lead developer was out here last week, and we have one of the companies I own is an ISV. And so we're doing a whole Payfac as a service thing right now. But he was funny. He wore this t-shirt when he came out, and it said months of programming can save hours of planning. And I was like, I love that. It's so true, because it's like, yeah, you could just sit down and for hours and actually map out what you want on a whiteboard, or just let your developer build it for a month and then have them rebuild it for another month and then rebuild it for another month. It's like, no, so I like that. I think your approach is really good. You just got to think through it. So, wow, I think we keep talking about this for a long time, but we better cut it short here. So, Kristin, this has been just unbelievably insightful. I'm so glad we had this conversation. Tell our audience how they could connect with you. Where would you send them to kind of learn more about you and connect with you?
I would honestly just go through LinkedIn. It's pretty straightforward, for me. So, just reach out there if you have any questions. I'm happy to help where I can, And if for anybody that has any great ideas about for the Midwest show, for topics and things of that nature, because we're always really looking for kind of the next big things in tech and, you know, where the industry is going, you know, feel free to shoot me ideas there as well.
Awesome. Love it. Kristin, awesome. Such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
So Patti, our podcast is brought to the audience today by NMI.com. NMI is just the leading gateway provider. And we talk about the omni-channel and the virtual terminal and all those things, which of course it is. But it is also just the leading processor agnostic gateway. And there's a lot of scenarios where you need a gateway. We just had this conversation with Kristin. There's a lot of times when you're becoming that wholesale ISO, you need a technology provider where you can have your own gateway that you're offering. And you don't want to, maybe you're not in a good position to build a gateway from scratch. Partner with NMI, and they're going to be able to give you all the things that you need for the gateway without taking a piece of the processing. And so as a processor agnostic provider of technology, if you're looking for a gateway that's going to have a lot of other omni-channel capabilities to it, but you just need that core gateway technology to accept transactions, to be able to run it through, you know, various terminals, you know, online gateways, whatever it is, commerce, shopping carts, all of that. Look no further than NMI.com. Head over to NMI.com. Let them know you heard about them on the Merchant Sales Podcast.
This is Questions from the Field, brought to you by ccsalespro.com. And now, here is Questions from the Field with James Shepard.
So Patti, of course, our interview today, which was fantastic with Kristin.
Very good, yes.
Diving very deep into the weeds in the industry and just so practical. However, I thought maybe I would diverge a good bit from that and talk about sales, because this is the Merchant Sales Podcast. I want to talk about sales agents a little bit. And I just want to talk about the profession of sales, the profession of merchant sales, and really becoming an expert in that. I was so interested recently in our Facebook group. We did a series of 4 panel discussions where we called it Sales September. And
I remember that.
Yeah. So it was available only to our Facebook group members. And I found, I think we ended up having 6, during different various panels, some attended, some didn't, but we had 6 panelists that were all people who had sold a lot of merchant accounts. They were they were directly selling. So maybe they did have some sub agents, but like they were directly involved currently in selling payment processing services. And we were having these conversations, and it was so amazing to me because I didn't like really plan out as much as I should have, like who the panelists were going to be to make sure we had a good mix. But it worked out that we had just like this perfect mix.
Of course.
It's just amazing how that worked out. And
well, there's such a great group of people on the Facebook group. I mean,
really
it's such a diverse group. There's so many super experienced people as well as novices, and everybody's so forthcoming and
willing to share. And it really is amazing.
Yeah.
If you're not in the group, you should check it out. It's just the CC Sales Pro community. Go to Facebook, just search for CC Sales Pro community. But anyway, so we had these different topics, and we talked about, you know, the opening pitch. We talked about overcoming objections. We talked about the presentation stage. We talked about closing the sale, which, by the way, these are going to be, by the time this comes out, I'm pretty sure this will be a YouTube playlist. So if you go to youtube.com/CC Sales Pro, you can watch them. But the thing about it that really struck me as so interesting is a couple of trends I noticed with all of our panelists. Number one trend that I noticed was experience and expertise. These people who are selling payment processing services, they understand payment processing. Now, they could not have answered all the questions that Kristin just answered for obvious reasons. They don't need to, but they understand how chargebacks work. They understand, you know, what interchange is. They understand BMD card brand fees and the difference between, you know, the bank that issues the card and the card brands. Like, they get it. And even more than that, though, they have very practical expertise into the technology solutions that they're offering. If they're selling Clover, they understand Clover. You know, if they're selling a terminal, they know how to go in and change the settings on that terminal. And there's a level of expertise. Some of it is intentional. A lot of it, of course, comes from experience of being out there and doing it. But I think it's very important for those that are listening that are struggling a bit to say, am I an expert at what I'm talking about to people? Am I an expert at what I'm providing? And so that was just such a a big trend that I noticed was that level of expertise. And, it spanned the gamut. We've had Jerron Rice on many times here. He was one of the panelists, and his level of expertise is almost like scholarly, you know what I mean? In terms of the issues but again, not with everything, but with the issues that the home service providers are running into with payments.
Right.
Because that's his niche. And that's really the second trend I noticed was specialization.
Niche. Yep.
Now I would say niche, but actually I wouldn't say, definitely some of them, they had the niche that they went after for sure. Most of them had 2 or 3, but that wasn't across the board. Some just went out and sold everybody, but the specialization. And so this is the thing. What is it that sets you apart? I think the key to being successful selling payment processing today is focus. And it's being willing to say no to so many things that you could offer, so many things that you could sell, that you say, no, I don't do that. I can't tell you how many times, just yesterday, somebody I really respect made an introduction for me to a company that was willing to do a deal with me that probably would have been extremely profitable. And it was about helping them access the kind of sales agent community to sell something that wasn't really payments related, directly.
Okay. Right.
And we talked for about 15 minutes, and I really respected both the people I was talking to. And I just said, let's stop the conversation here for just a minute, because I don't want to waste anybody's time. This is outside of my lane. I stay in my lane. There's no amount of money you can pay me to get out of my lane. My lane is payment processing. I help companies that are directly involved in payments through the consulting practice, and I provide free resources to agents that sell payment processing. That is the one and only thing that I do. And so this is outside the scope of that. So I'm gonna say no. And it's conversations like that where I give up that money. That is why I'm able to make so much money from the companies who are involved in payments, because they know James is the guy that does that. Right. And so as a result, I'm able to focus my brand, focus my reputation, my personal brand, my company brand. And it's like, this is what I do. We had this big debate, and it's still kind of raging internally, about the future of ISOAMP, which is our full service statement analysis provider, because we have the training software. And it's like, well, where does that live? And so, but a big part of that conversation is, well, wait a minute. I don't know if I want to put that in with ISOAMP, because that would be broadening it to say ISOAMP is there to help ISOs grow or something like that, versus saying it's the leader in full service statement analysis. Well, everybody knows.
You start diverging. I mean, it's happened to so many companies. I mean,
the brand becomes less powerful because people don't know what it means. They don't know what it stands for. And so in that same way, if you're an agent or even a small ISO, well, big ISO for that matter, but in this conversation for the agent and the small ISO, what do you stand for? What is your brand? And again, your brand might be your personal name, right? But what does your brand stand for, and what does it not stand for? More importantly, right? Like, what are you not going to do? And you got to resist the urge to scatter into a million different directions,
and not be good at anything.
Exactly. And not only that, you say, well, no, I can be good at 5 different things. You might be able to be good at 5 different things, but you can't get people to believe that you're good at 5 different things, or know that you're good at 5 different things.
And are you at the top of your game in each of those 5 things?
Exactly. Yep. So that I think is really important. And so my advice to you, based on the panel, first of all, go watch the panel discussions on YouTube. They're great. But my advice to you as an agent or ISO is, think through carefully and decide, okay, what do I specialize in? And again, maybe your specialty is helping small physical location businesses that need simple solutions. It doesn't have to be vertical specific necessarily, but then make sure you identify those solutions you're going to offer, those 3 or 4 things that, this gateway, these 2 terminals, and this point of sale, and then understand those deeply and be an expert at that. And then you come to market with that. But what that means is then when you get a massive merchant that reaches out to you, right? Well, you say, you know what? I don't have the expertise. Sorry.
Yeah.
I don't have the expertise. Let me get you somebody who can do that. What's your area?
And by doing that, you're going to give yourself more business because they're going to respect you.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. So there you go. A little bit of advice today for the sales agent.
Great advice. Thanks, James.
This is the Insider's Report with Patti Murphy, brought to you by The Green Sheet.
Well, James, interesting news I read this week in the New York Times. Zelle, the banking industry's answer to Venmo, is under attack from fraudsters as well as from Congress. So, let's spread the wealth around, right?
Right.
So to speak. We talk a lot about Congress and Durbin, and now we have another thing, because the P2P payment app has been making headlines because consumers are getting defrauded and the banks are refusing to cover the expenses. To cover, to reimburse them. Here's how the New York Times reported it. Police reports and dispatches from industry analysts make it clear that the network has become a preferred tool for grifters like romance scammers, cryptocurrency con artists, and those who prowl social media sites advertising concert tickets, purebred puppies, only to disappear with the buyer's cash after they pay. Well, that got the attention of the Senate Banking Committee, and they posed questions to the big banks that own Zelle. I mean, just as a backdrop, for those who don't know, as I said, Zelle is the banking industry's answer to Venmo. It is a P2P network that's owned by, I believe it's like 16 of the largest banks in the country, and is accessed by most banks and credit unions.
Right.
So some of the big bankers, like Chase and JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo, were before the Senate Banking Committee, and they were asked to provide data on how much fraud is going on. And so apparently the data shows that Zelle is rampant with fraud and theft, and that few customers are getting refunded. That didn't set well with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who referred to it as potentially violating federal law. She was particularly irked at JP Morgan and Wells because they didn't provide the requested data. Citi and Truist and a few of the others did, but JP Morgan and Chase did. But here's some of the reports that they got from, I believe it was the 4 big banks that did report data. 4 banks are on track to receive in scam and fraud claims exceeding $255 million this year.
Ooh, okay.
Up from 90 million in 2020. Wow. That's a huge jump. PNC Bank, for example, reported the number of fraud and scam claims from Zelle customers rose nearly 50%, from 8,800 and change in 2020 to 12,300 and change in 2020 so far this year, excuse me. So that's in 2 years it rose 50%. US Bank saw 14,800, almost 14,900 claims in 2020. That bank's on track to see 45,000 fraud claims this year.
Wow. Good night.
So of the 190,000 cases of scams involving $213 million in payments last year and the first half of this year, fewer than 10% of the claims and 11% of the money was repaid to customers.
Wow. Visa and MasterCard are looking pretty good right now.
Aren't they? Yeah, I know, right? Anyway, but this is from the report. The data provided by the banks revealed that they reimbursed customers for only 47% of the dollar amount of cases in which customers reported unauthorized payments. These are not just the scams; these are the genuinely unauthorized.
Right.
So they're talking about maybe getting the CFPB to crack the whip, because it has regulatory authority over Zelle and other P2P payment platforms.
Right.
They want Senator Warren and a couple of the other senators said they want the CFPB to issue guidance clarifying how Regulation E, which of course is the electronic funds regulation, okay. Yep. For when you use your debit cards and so forth,
right?
How it applies to these transactions, because you know how we talked about how the Durbin Amendment came out before online debit was big.
Yeah.
Well, the Reg E came out in the 1980s.
Right. Way before Zelle or P2P or Venmo of any kind.
None of that stuff was around. And they've amended it a few times, but they really haven't addressed these P2P claims.
Yep.
And I think, especially as we're going into in 2023, FedNow is going to be live. We already have RTP. These networks are using RTP right now to clear transactions. So, with FedNow, everybody's going to be expecting instant payments.
Right.
And I think if the fraud's getting that bad right now, imagine how it's going to look in a real-time payment environment. Yep. I think it's a good idea, frankly, that somebody does look at these. I mean, heck, the credit card, issuers are reimbursing customers. That's why we have chargeback processes, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And you and I have talked in the past about how in a real-time payment environment, chargebacks are going to be a thorny issue.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing evidence of that with this. Yeah.
Wow. Super interesting. I had no idea, actually. It's opens up a whole can of worms. So I'll be very interested to see how that all plays out. Thanks for bringing us in the loop on that one, Patti.
Sure thing.
Thank you for listening to the Merchant Sales Podcast. Whether you are an industry veteran, processing executive, or just trying to learn about the payment space, we appreciate your time. The Merchant Sales Podcast is a joint production of greensheet.com and ccsalespro.com, and we hope you will tune in next week for more information and tips on building your merchant services business.